David Gibson is the director of the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University. Welcome to the show, David.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Always good to be with you. David, we want to talk to you today about what happens once a pope is elected. We did a very big Inside the Vatican deep dive episode going through what happens when the pope dies and then what happens inside the conclave. But once they reach the 2/3 majority, we kind of haven't covered that yet. And it's going to be important to know just in a little bit here. So first off, for our listeners, can you talk to me about your background in the Vatican? Why you're such a good person to talk to about this?
Yes. Why am I even here? So good. Yes, I went from working with the Jesuits, for the Jesuits at Vatican Radio back in the 80s to working at a Jesuit University of New York, Fordham University. So I've kind of come full circle. And yeah, I came to Rome in 85, started working at Vatican Radio, at the English program at Vatican Radio. And they were, that's 7 or 8 years away from the year of 3 popes.
Right.
1978. Exactly. And 2 conclaves that year. Who knew there wouldn't be another one until 2005? And I'd be well ensconced in daily journalism back in the United States, in New York and New Jersey, where I'm from. And I did come over for the reporting on the 2005 election. In fact, I had written a book coming out of the sexual abuse crisis in 2003, the Boston wave of it. And my publisher liked it. And so they gave me a contract to write about whoever was the next pope. And so, of course, I was planning, came over as soon as, we knew John Paul had died. And I was one of the lucky ones who I had, or unlucky ones. A lot of people got book contracts to write about the next pope in 1990.
Oh my gosh.
And, half of them were dead by the time the pope died. And I'm not kidding. And I actually did a documentary for CNN on who might be the next pope. And we interviewed, I think, 5 or 6 cardinal candidates, 3 of whom died before the next conclave. So anyway, hardly anybody was there except for John Davis, who remembered 1978.
Yeah.
So it's kind of new for everybody. In fact, there were only, I think, 1 or 2 cardinals in the 2005 conclave who'd been in 1978. One of them being Joseph Ratzinger.
There you go.
Remembered how the conclave worked.
Exactly. Yeah. So, it's all kind of like, what, where do you do what? How do you light the smoke? How do you do anything? So anyway, I had a contract to write a book on whoever came out, and I was really looking forward to, some surprise candidate.
Did you pre-write it on Benedict or not?
I did not at all. And so out comes the person who everybody knows everything about.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
And so I was like, my jaw kind of was like, okay, well, this is going to be interesting. There's another story. It did turn out to be fascinating because I had to go back, kind of reread everything he wrote, and which is great because you have all these presuppositions, even if you follow this thing too much as we do inside baseball, and you just start from scratch. The other thing I would just say is, and this goes also for 2013, I was there as well, the cardinal who goes in and does come out a pope is a different person in many respects. And I think that's something you can't emphasize enough for a lot of understandable reasons. You take a new name, you wear a new cassock, and you're at the top of the heap, if you will, and you've been chosen, let's say, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So
should also mention you got to do a little bit of that waiting, not necessarily for the book, but America commissioned you to write our obituary for Pope Benedict, and we waited years after he resigned the papacy. So I remember we used to take that out once a year and dust it off and make sure it didn't need to be updated.
There was, I'd get these periodic emails from Tim Reedy or others at America saying, could you update this?
People are really learning how the sausage gets made.
I know.
The journalism business.
It is. It's like, everything's when you get older in the church and someone has to do a profile of you, it's an obituary.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so we're in the conclave. The winner reaches the 2/3 majority. We know that kind of everybody is quietly keeping a tally. And so once it gets to 2/3, gets to 89 votes in this conclave's case, that people will start applauding.
That's right.
And walk us through what happens next.
Then I think it's the dean of the College of Cardinals comes up to the man who has been chosen and says, do you accept? That's the first big one. And, in these days, as they're in the conclave now and in these days before, they are making some intimations at some of the people. Do you accept? They did that with Bergoglio.
Right.
back, when,
Explain
in the
what you mean
days
by that
before.
for people who might not know the story.
Well, in the sense that I think he told one priest he ran into as he was walking around saying his rosary, he said, "I fear I'm in danger."
Yeah.
This is a day or two before they go into the conclave proper, which they've done, going the mass, and then they're closed with a key. But they start asking questions. Do you have one lung?
Right.
Exactly. That story. And Bergoglio himself, Francis.
Because they don't want to spend all this effort coalescing to a 2/3 consensus around someone who's going to have to say no for some reason.
Yeah. And it truly is an astonishing thing. I mean, Ratzinger compared it to a guillotine, the votes tallying to a guillotine coming down.
Francis said he felt peace.
Yeah. Well, that's him, and that's beautiful. And that's also another story. That goes back to the kind of transformation. I don't think I would feel peace. I would. And honestly,
it's a rough job.
It's also, but that reality sinks in. Obviously, you have to say yes, I guess. It would be pretty bad. But anyway, so after the guy presumably says yes, he said, obviously the next big one, by what name shall you be known? These are all questions made in Latin, which I won't even attempt. And he gives his name. Everyone comes around, congratulates him, kisses the genuflex, kisses the ring.
Somebody runs and tells the sick guys who are staying in Santa Marta, who were not there.
That's right, exactly. And then, of course, they have to burn the ballots.
So this is the point at which the outside world begins to learn what's going on.
Yeah, begins, but that's just it, Sam. It's so there's two things. What happens when a pope is elected? They all know, but the first we get is smoke, dark, whitish,
what color is it?
Gray, and then the bells. The bells ringing is really, I think, the confirmation, but we don't know for an hour or more, who it is.
Right.
It's like, habemus, papam, we got a pope, and then you're just standing around.
And I think that's important to remind listeners of, because I think in the popular imagination, this has sort of been conflated, like white smoke means pope. And like white smoke means everybody runs to St. Peter's Square to wait to find out who the pope is.
White smoke means 45 minutes at least.
I know.
2013, an hour and a half or so.
Yeah.
You mentioned John Davis earlier, who was a Vatican correspondent for many, many years here. He tells a great story in his book about this delay in 2005 between the white smoke coming out, which, as you mentioned, it's difficult to tell whether it's white or gray. And so I've been talking to journalists in recent days who talk about how they were being pressured by their TV networks to call it. Is it white or is it black? But even then, the confirmation is the bells. But Davis tells this story about how there was like a 15-minute delay in the bells because the right person didn't call the bell ringer. And because it's the Vatican and there's strict protocol, if it's not the right person, it's the Swiss guard on the phone who says, ring the bells, ring the bells. No. They say, nope.
Well, they definitely don't want to ring the bells by accident.
Of course.
Yes. It's like calling the key electoral state that's going to put one presidential candidate over the top. It's like you don't want to be too early on it.
Yeah.
It's kind of a big deal. And, it's the Vatican. You could lose your job.
Okay, so all these Romans come running down the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, and then they come up the Via della Conciliazione. It's super exciting. What happens when we finally find something out?
Well, part of that whole hour time, again, is accepting the congratulations and talking to everyone, but also getting your cassock, because you have to get dressed.
Yeah.
And you have to find one that fits and all that. And then you kind of have to walk all the way across through the Pauline Chapel and the whole thing into the Aula della Benedizione, and you have to kind of get everything ready to come be out. And then who is it again, Colleen? Who does the announcement?
I think the proto-deacon?
The proto-deacon. I always get that wrong. There's so many deans and deacons and orders of bishops and priests. I should leave it to Father Sawyer.
Let me pause you before we get to the announcement. Let's talk about the cassocks, because you said they have to get dressed and find one that fits. Yeah. So for people who might not know, usually there's in what they call the room of tears, right? Because people are weeping as they realize this awful job they've been given. But they're crying and they're putting on a cassock, and there are three options. There's a small, medium, and large. I've been told that this year, Cardinal Farrell said, he told Gamarelli, don't bother. We're going to just use the ones that we already have, save some money. Farrell's in charge of the finances right now. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know, is it true, the story that John the 23rd couldn't find one that fit and they had to split it down the back?
John the 23rd was rather rotund, peasant from northern Italy. He liked his wonderful man, so good, loved his food. I think in that Hannah Arendt essay, she says he knew the he would order Parmesan cheese by the numbers that were stamped into the wheel. He knew the very best ones. Gourmand. I love it, honestly. And it was, they had to split it up the back. But of course, you don't see it.
Of course.
And when I met Mancinelli, there was a story, I think Cindy Wooden did at CNS, that Mancinelli, another
of the Roman tailors
here, right in Borgo Pio, just donated 3 to them and said, it was kind of an interesting fact, said, just worrying about the breadth and the small, medium, and large.
Sure.
He said the length we'll worry about. Nobody's going to see the
That's
length.
true.
Yeah. I know, but like,
just
what
don't
if he
trip.
trips over? What do you do? Exactly. It's like, for me, I just kept thinking, the Pope trips over, face plants when you come out. That's not a good look. But with John the 23rd, obviously a split in the back doesn't matter. That's what all the brocade is for.
I'll have to review the tape to see if he backed out.
I know. But also the other thing is, remember Ratzinger coming out with his thing? He said, he was asking somebody, he said, what's it like out there? He said, it's a little chilly. He said, well, I'm going to put on a sweater. So he had a little black sweater under there.
That's so funny. I didn't know that.
No, yeah, you go see it. So it's like, as he raises his hands, he's got a black sweater. He's just a little old German professor, fundamentally. He's like, is it cold? Yes, it's cold. So he did that. And then Bergoglio famously
didn't wear the cape.
Didn't wear the cape at all. And just came out.
That's the red cape over the white vest.
It's the mozzetta.
Exactly. Mozzetta.
The fur-trimmed symbol of
the whole thing. And he famously may have said, the carnival is over. It's perhaps apocryphal, but as we say in the tabloids, too good to check out. So I always go with it.
Terrible.
And then what will actually happen, of course, from that central loggia over St. Peter's in the middle of the basilica,
the loggia of blessings,
over St. Peter's Square, is this famous habemus papam announcement.
Exactly. Yeah.
I've got the Latin here if you would like.
Oh, who's going to do it? Because I'm not.
I'll beg off.
I'm going to give it a stab. So, Annuncio vobis gaudium magnum.
Annuncio vobis gaudium magnum.
I announced to all of you a great joy. Habemus papam. We have a pope.
Habemus papam.
This is the part that I need to take a breath for.
Yeah.
Eminentissimum ac reverendissimum
Dominum Georgium Marium Sancte Romani Ecclesiae Cardinalem Bergoglio.
The eminent and reverend Lord, then his name, cardinal, last name, qui sibi nomen imposuit, and then the name he has taken as
Who
Pope.
takes the name?
Franciscum.
And by that time, your brain is just scrambled.
Yeah. Because when we're all waiting on live media or whatever, we're waiting for that first name, but then you don't really know. And then you're waiting for the last name, and then you're like, oh, okay.
Both of which have been like Latinified.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
But also
Josephum or something like that.
Yeah.
George, Jorge.
Yep.
Right.
George. Well, George Pell. Who is it? It's like we're going to say Giorgio. It's like
totally.
So before we go out there, how many Joes are there? How many Luigis are? You got to like.
Yeah. Although it's funny, I was rewatching the tape from 2005, and as soon as I say Josephum, the crowd's clapping.
Yeah,
you know who it is.
Yeah.
But we journalists are memorizing lists of cardinals and cardinals' names. Yeah. And every fact we can possibly internalize about them is because, in fact, as the rest of Rome goes running to St. Peter's Square, journalists start taking up positions at various rooftops around St. Peter's Square for the live cameras.
I know.
Right. And so we get the first name, the last name. We're trying to look up everything that we need to know, but also you got to listen for what name did they take, because that's important too. Okay, so then what happens next? They get announced, and then presumably they come out,
They come out, yes. They come out on the balcony, and they look at the crowd. And I just remember, I don't know why I remember it so clearly, but just Bergoglio just coming out and I just remember almost saying, almost out loud, was with a couple of journalist friends, like, say something.
Yeah.
Say something.
He pauses for a moment and he looks, and you can see him kind of freak out.
I get it.
Yeah.
Totally get it.
Famously, what he says first, which is so great.
Buonasera.
Buonasera.
Cannot beat that. Just love it.
People made a big deal out of that, but how does it stack up to how other popes have greeted?
Well, I have to say, I think it was everything in retrospect makes sense.
Yeah.
Sure.
Makes sense. We create a narrative around it, and a legitimate narrative too. But I wasn't there. But if you remember, if you look at the tape of John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła coming out, that was remarkable. It was also very affecting and very
He was
engaged.
pretty informal, right?
Yes, and he also, look, he's the first non-Italian in 450 years.
Yeah.
And he just very kindly says, luckily he was good Italian, got better, got very Romano. And but he said, I think something to the effect of, I'm come from a faraway country. He said, I'm the Bishop of Rome. He said, Italian is not my first language, so please correct me.
Yeah.
I ask you to correct me if I've made a mistake. Infallibility out the window, according to, but
but it's another one of these. It's a gesture of humility.
It's right up there with pray for me, pray over me, which Francis asked.
And we should remember that John Paul II, I mean, in his own way, certainly brought the papacy out from behind the walls of St. Peter's and was the Pope most in contact with the world that we'd seen ever.
Yeah. And again, even all of these things, white smoke, was only 150 years old, maybe as a signal, or 100 years old. I think 1903 was the first actual recorded instance of it being used, to signal a new pope. And they had the wet straw, dry straw thing, which was even worse.
Wet straw for white,
but even coming out
on
the balcony had not been used, was sporadically used. I think it was Pius XI was the first to come out because, again, Pope was a prisoner of the Vatican. Right. He always did it inside St. Peter's Basilica. Mm-hmm. I mean, so this whole thing that we take for granted is this it's always been this way. Yeah, it's actually not. And again, with John Paul coming out, and they don't get enough credit, I think, and John Paul I, who is another podcast, could be seen as more of the progenitor of Francis, I think, in many respects, but. It came out but made that connection. And then, of course, you mentioned it, Bergoglio Francis, asking us to pray over him. Yeah. And again, that's when you start to think,
see who they're going to be.
Look at how he's dressed, look at what he says, look at how he speaks.
I actually think that this time around, there's going to be immense pressure on the person to maybe not wear the mozzetta or whatever.
Yeah, I think there's going to be pressure to, do various things. Are you going to move back to the Apostolic Palace? Are you going to stay there? It's...
Yeah, certainly all those things are going to have additional weight. Whereas, when Francis was doing this, when he decided on Santa Marta instead of the Apostolic Palace, when he went and paid his own bill and all that stuff, it was completely novel. But now it will be judged not only for the symbolic weight it carries in itself, but also for what it says about that person's judgement of how Francis did it.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say just one thing just came to mind. I realized, I think, we'll have to find out if this is, but it was either on the Vatican website, I don't think it got printed, but they announced Francis the First.
Oh, no. A bunch of news articles called him Francis the First.
But I think something on the Vatican website or something did, which he'll only be Francis the First if we get Francis the Second.
Right.
Otherwise, he's just Pope Francis.
Sure.
So that was a funny thing. And I think there was a Vatican website glitch on that.
All right. So the first act of the new pope, besides greeting people, is giving the urbi et orbi blessing. This is the blessing to the city and the world. And you want to talk a little about the significance of that?
Well, I'd say it really establishes who the Pope is and what his role is. And also, I think, to the two things that he stresses, which he specifically pointed to, was, I'm your bishop, the Bishop of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
You're blessing this. You're the bishop of this city and this community. And you can see by all the people filling the square how honestly important that is to them on so many levels. It still remains so important, but also to the world. And obviously, since the original Pilgrim Pope, Paul VI, and then John Paul II, of course, and in a more spiritual way or pastoral way, John the 23rd, but you've been the pastor to the world. So I think that's what that really, it takes on a new kind of significance from the earlier just kind of monarchical divine command sort of institution of it.
So there'll also be some liturgical ceremony that happens in the first days of the new papacy. So the first big thing, of course, is the inaugural mass, the new pope's first mass as pope, which will be usually a couple days after the election.
Yeah, and that depends. It really depends on what day of the week the election happened. With Bergoglio, I'm trying to remember, but I think it was towards the end of the week, because I remember the two things that happened. First, it was his first Sunday Angelus.
Okay.
It was before the inauguration, which he waited a few days to the Feast of St. He waited like 6 days. I think Ratzinger waited like 4 days. They got to get it all together.
And we could likely see something like that again, because if the election happens on Thursday or Friday, there's going to be a Sunday Angelus, presumably before an inaugural mass.
Absolutely. So and I've been asking, and nobody knows.
Of course not.
Everything's kind of in flux. Yeah. So if I were to say, they're in the conclave, if this goes to a couple of days, as they think, Friday, Saturday latest, boom. So his first kind of public liturgical expression or appearance will be the Sunday Angelus in front of everybody. And again, I remember when Bergoglio came out, and that was one of those moments, many moments, that you knew something was different, because he said, he just started speaking so naturally, a la John the 23rd to the crowd. He said, I don't want to make publicity for my cardinals, but I have this book here by Cardinal Walter Kasper on mercy. And I remember I was with a couple.
And also announcing mercy as one of the themes of the pontificate right away.
And also that, Cardinal Kasper had not necessarily been on the inside of the recent track of things. And he had very well respected by Cardinal Ratzinger, but they had very strong debates in the pages of I think it was America magazine. Is that right? Yeah, and one of those journals. Yeah, the Jesuit journal. No, terrific stuff. Very educational. It's terrific. But the fact that again he mentions Kasper by name and mercy, really, was an astrological signal. The other thing, and I'm trying to remember the sequence. He also meets with journalists. Which John the 23rd, Paul VI, Pope John Paul II really started it, but there's a formal kind of meeting with journalists as the number of. And we always think this is a huge thing. Every conclave, this is a huge thing. It wasn't always covered, obviously, in the way it is. We didn't have the mass media, we didn't have the internet, that kind of thing. Now it's become such an internet sensation. Even a couple of days before they went into conclave at the general congregations, there was a note that the cardinals were speaking about the coverage and saying their thanks for it, and also saying this is an expression of the power of the gospel message.
Well, I would say if you walk up Via de Conciliazione or into St. Peter's Square now, there are journalists doing stand-ups and influencer types doing phone videos and everything all over the place. It's like more journalists almost than pilgrims, it seems.
And I also just have to make a note. There's often the church and media is a problematic thing. The Vatican, closed shop, everything's so secret, ish. But, the Vatican press office, they're so accommodating. They credential almost everyone.
Yeah, they've been really...
I mean, there are people I wouldn't even get a credential to, and there's like 4,000. And the TV stands that are built out there, everything that goes on, they try to do everything possible for you. So, and again, the meeting with the media, so that's become a real fixture. And that's a real indicator.
Not a liturgical ceremony,
no,
but still a kind of ceremony.
But here, Sam, probably this is too much time, but I'll tell you 2005, Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI comes out. It was in the Paul VI audience hall because there's so many journalists now. Yeah, couple hundred. Right. And who was hanging around?
4,000 accredited, right?
Yeah, who knows how many. But, I think there were 2,000 in 2013, 2,000 media in the hall. And so it's like, a meeting with the media. It's like, I remember Ratzinger in 2005 coming out, wearing the red shoes, and he kind of comes out and being his Ratzinger self. And he had 4 paragraphs, and he had a paragraph written in 4 different languages, French, Italian, German, and English, not Spanish. This is not on him necessarily. Someone wrote this for him. He came out, said, hello, read this paragraph in 4 different languages, gave the apostolic blessing, and walked off. That was a meeting with journalists, and everybody's like, okay. And, that's who he was, okay? That's who he was. But the big thing, in 2013, Bergoglio Francis comes out, and he reads a prepared text. In my mind's eye, I think he put it down halfway through, but he just read this desultory text and said, this is written for him. And he put it down. He said, but maybe you want to know how it is I pick my name Francis. Because it said there are some people talking, all the Jesuits. They're talking, it's Francis Xavier, Francis Xavier. And everybody else is like Francis of Assisi. And he said, no, it's Francis of Assisi. And told the wonderful story of, the folk come down, and Claudio Homus, the great late Brazilian cardinal, just grabbed him and hugged him and said, do not forget the poor. do not forget the poor. And he said immediately came into my mind the man of peace, say, Francis. So, and you're just, as a journalist, honestly, as a human, as a Catholic, you're just like, this is water, after a stretch in the desert. It's just so, it's a wonderful copy, and it's so beautiful. And it really, again, and here's a guy who didn't do media interviews, who was like just a kind of grumpy cardinal headed for retirement. The last thing I just want to say about the liturgical element, this was one of the biggest journalistic dilemmas of my career. So he goes through this whole thing, and he tells it. Then he gets up.
Wait, Francis or Benedict?
Francis. He gets up and he said, this is where the Pope would normally give you his apostolic blessing. But he said, I know some of you are probably not believers or are not Catholic. Yes, he knew his audience.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Media. And he said, so I don't want to offend your conscience, but know that you have my blessing in my heart. And he walked off the stage. That's it. The lead to everyone's story was how he picked his name,
right?
The story, hummus, a church for the poor. That's the lead. But that was as important a story, and certainly in retrospect, to indicate what kind of papacy it would be.
Yeah, and it's kind of amazing as we look back on those days, how much of the symbolism, the themes, and also kind of the, for lack of a better term, like the iconography of his papacy was set up in those first few days.
Yes, absolutely.
I wanted to raise here that Jerry O'Connell, our usual Vatican correspondent, he drew a parallel between Francis's paying his hotel bill at Via della Scrofa, at the place that he had stayed before the conclave, and Francis paying for his own burial. I mean, just that really touched me.
That's a beautiful thing. That's Jerry. He really knows.
Totally.
Yeah.
So I want to maybe shift us now to thinking forward. So we've been talking a lot about Francis, those early days, but David, what are you going to be looking for in the early days of this new pontificate?
Well, again, like these things, these early meetings, these early indicators, what can he do? How does he distinguish himself? He, as we say, the church does not believe in cloning, human cloning. He can't be Francis.
Right.
And again, that's how your heart went out to Benedict. We tell these stories about Benedict, but you were following John Paul, or the kind of ghost of John Paul, Santo Subito, millions in the streets, but also the John Paul of 1989 and 1979, to be honest. And this groundswell for this very charismatic
right.
pope.
And then you got this theology professor.
Yeah, I mean, the theology professor. But to his credit, he didn't try to be.
No, he was just
and
himself.
He said that. And he said he did, Ratzinger knew, he was himself, but he still had to travel. He still had to do things were not what he would normally want to do.
Yeah.
But I think you gotta watch for how he connects with the people of Rome. There's a media thing. My kind of thing, and this is me projecting, but it's also what John Paul did very well, I think, was visiting Roman parishes on a regular basis. Francis, for all of his did not
Maria Maggiore all the time, but not really all the other places in Rome.
Exactly. Rome will visit him more than he visited them going forward, I believe. And, you are the Bishop of Rome, and I think that's also a way that you can be a role model as a bishop. In a way, I just finished an essay I wrote that, he described himself to Jerry as the world's parish priest.
Yeah.
Not that he was substituting for it at all, but that he was a role model for a parish priest. Yeah. Remember, he celebrated Mass in the chapel, and it was reported on every day.
During the pandemic.
Even from the beginning of his...
Oh, sure. And then
every morning I'd get
they
up.
started the live stream during the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. And, eventually that went away, but it was amazing. But he was really and 8-minute homilies, even though he would go 20 minutes, but whatever. It was... But again, he was really saying, what should a parish priest be like? You accompany your people, you go out, you do these things. There's also a space to say, what should a bishop be? How should a bishop be to his flock? Which is, frankly, what you are.
Yeah.
So that's something I think that I would look for. It's hard because these early days are all about symbols, but the first homily is going to be
That'll
key.
Be huge.
Is going to be key. And, I think it'll be very Christological, as they always have been, but always in a different key.
Right.
It's always in a different key. And what key are you going to take? I do want to get back to the issue of language.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
This is going to be something to look for because it's important. You are the Bishop of Rome, and you are basically chief executive of the Roman Curia.
Yeah.
We have all these lovely scenarios of incredibly cool papal contenders, and if they can't speak Italian at all, when you come out there, are you going to take a few moments to maybe write? If you really can't, if they choose someone who can't speak Italian very well, how's that going to come off? So it'll be important. It'll just establish early on that kind of connection or how this Pope intends to move forward. And then, of course, first encyclical down the road, some months down the road. Of
course, that's your programmatic document.
The programmatic document, but also remember that was not the way with Francis.
Right, because he had a hand-me-down document from Benedict that he had to get out
which
first.
He very beautifully said it was a encyclical a quattro mani, at four hands. There's a joint one, which is beautiful. But his first encyclical was his visit to Lampedusa. Remember? So a symbol, substance, the whole thing.
Yeah.
Nothing. It was liturgical. It was a mass on a upturned boat as an altar.
Right.
So again, those are the things that we're going to be looking for going forward.
And then, David, let me also ask you about something else that I certainly expect to see is, we in the media, both in the Catholic media and in the secular media, will instantly read, or as instantly as we can, every word that this man has ever written before, whoever's elected Pope. And we're also going to go looking for the stories, both the good stories and the not so good stories. So, I expect when Francis was elected, we got stories about his time as provincial in Argentina and his, what did or didn't happen in his involvement with the government and going back and forth with the government during the Argentinian Civil War. But I expect, we're going to see negative coverage in the immediate first days of this new papacy as well. Probably something, whoever it is, about how he's handled or not handled abuse cases well, et cetera. Could you say something about what you expect along those lines?
Yeah, it's going to be, look, there are no background checks for Pope. So the only way to do the due diligence is through the very rough and tumble journalistic and that kind of thing, and social media stuff. And again, I think it's always, ugly, the Hitler Youth stuff with Ratzinger.
Oh, that's right, of course.
Yeah, remember that?
Yes.
But there's also, I think, unless somebody comes up with some incredible smoking gun, you also just kind of let it go, let it play out. Like the Hitler Youth stuff, everybody saw that was overplayed. But you're going to get some tabloids who are going to run with it, and people are going to talk about it. The dirty war, his dirty war record with Bergoglio, Pope.
Well, and in every case that I can think of, like the bombastic story comes out, and then you have a bunch of other journalists who go and check it out, and then a little ways down the line, it all kind of gets sorted out. You find out slowly what the truth actually is. Which
is not to say that these stories aren't important, but I think it is good context because actually, until you just reminded us, I would have struggled to remember what the version of this was for Benedict.
Yeah.
And it was the Hitler Youth story. I remember it better with Francis, I think, just because I was more involved in the media when that was happening. But there will be one of these that probably 5 or 10 years down the line might not be the biggest part of the story, even though it's going to feel perhaps like a crisis on day 3 of the papacy or something.
But there's already been some vetting to a degree with all this.
Yeah.
Which can seem circus-like and ridiculous in many ways of the media and people chasing after stories and things coming out Parolin fainted or whatever, but that's also a way of kind of getting stuff out there. Cardinal Prevost, who's thought of as someone who could walk out tomorrow, who knows, first American Pope or second. Right. You want to talk about the Americas as Latin America and North America, but his record in Peru. Which is, again, that's been out there. And if you read more deeply into it, it's not perhaps quite as advertised, but that will get another airing and all that's going to happen. So it's going to be these dual narratives of, this joy and this fascination and curiosity and all the newness. And is he going to pay his hotel bill? And also these other kind of things. What can we dig up? What are we going to dig up? What's going to get traction?
Well, and I also think, it'll be interesting to see because so much of Francis's own evolution on abuse was learning to be corrected. I think particularly of his experience in Chile,
Yeah.
where he initially didn't really recognize the testimony of survivors, and then made a significant move and realized that he'd been wrong. And, look, anyone who they elect who's been a bishop for more than 25 years is going to likely have not dealt perfectly with every abuse case that ever crossed his desk, and may in fact have dealt very badly with some of them. I think one of the questions going forward for whoever's elected pope will be, is he defensive about that, or does he recognize that as a place where the church needs reform and repentance?
That's exactly it. How do you approach this? You just say, I did the wrong thing. And Bergoglio Francis, in his first interview with Antonio Spadaro, just talked about how, he was too young. He was a 36-year-old provincial of Uruguay and Argentina. He said, I was too authoritarian, I think was the word he used. It's like, but that's the attitude you have to take.
Yeah.
You're 76 now, you were 36 then.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just that, that was just youthful. It's like, no, I made a mistake. I wish I hadn't done that. Or I wish I hadn't been that. That is simply the approach you need to take, I think.
Well, that perhaps gives us maybe a place to wrap up. You mentioned Pope Francis' first big interview, which was, of course, groundbreaking when he did it. And then he did seemingly an interview for 3 months after that. So, but do you...
Pope Francis' groundbreaking first interview run by America.
Yes, published cooperatively by America and other Jesuit journals. And then his other groundbreaking interview with America in November of 2022. But do you expect whoever's elected as Pope this time, do you think that Pope will give interviews? And if so, where would you look for the first interview? Besides, of course, America.
Depends who it is, right?
Exactly. In many respects, it does depend. I think they will have to.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is something you just can't have somebody who
being mysterious as Pope no longer works.
Yeah. And let's, also be honest. Pope Benedict, was out there.
Yeah.
And
right.
you have to, he tended to give book length interviews.
Right.
Yeah.
And is a little more careful, a little bit more curated, but incredibly extensive.
Mm-hmm.
He knew everything he thought, and his writings and everything. He had an incredible record that was out there. And, he continued to do that. But I think that it's also the way, how are you going to interact with media? Are you going to go, when he meets with the media first time, are you going to give a little interview there? Are you going to, are you going to sit down with somebody? How are you going to do this?
I want to know what happens on the papal flight. I want to know if he comes out and does this freewheeling press conference or not.
Everybody's done it, and I think you almost have to. I was on the flights with John Paul many times, and that was a little more scripted. And of course, as he became older and whatnot, it was a little more curated. I mean, Francis was so unbuttoned, and again, that really drove people crazy. So, are you going to have a communications office worthy of the name, or are they just going to be sitting around, drinking coffee, wondering what their job is?
All right, Dave Gibson, it's been a pleasure. We look forward to looking at all of the things that are going to happen very early in this pontificate, and hopefully following some of your advice on what to look for. Thanks.
Thank you.
And to the next Holy Father, an open invitation to an interview on any of America's platforms.
The microphones are open.
Indeed.
Perfect.